I need you to stop whatever you are doing right now and answer one question. If a crypto security firm, the actual professionals who track these crimes for a living, publicly looked at the abduction of an 84-year-old woman in Tucson, Arizona, and classified it the exact same way they classify violent crypto extortion cases happening right now in France, Germany, and across Europe, would that change how you think about this entire case? Because that is not speculation. That is not an internet theory cooked up by someone with too much time and a laptop. That actually happened. A company called CertiK, widely regarded as one of the leading blockchain security firms on the planet, looked at the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie and placed it inside a category of crime with a name that sounds almost too blunt to be real. They called it a wrench attack. And once you understand what that phrase actually means, you may never look at this case the same way again. Let's not waste time on what you already know. You already know Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home outside Tucson. You already know about the masked man on the doorbell camera. You already know about the gloves, the untouched Bitcoin wallet, the fake ransom texter who has already pleaded guilty and is sitting in treatment waiting for sentencing. That part of the story has been told 100 times by 100 different channels. What almost nobody is talking about, what almost nobody has actually sat down and explained properly, is this single theory that a group of financial crime researchers believes could reframe the entire motive behind this crime. So today, we are doing exactly one thing. We are breaking down the wrench attack theory, piece by piece, and asking the uncomfortable question underneath it. What if Nancy Guthrie was never actually the target at all? First, you need to understand where this term even comes from, because it did not start with law enforcement and it did not start with a court filing. It started years ago as a dark joke inside the cybersecurity community, a webcomic that pointed out something almost embarrassingly simple. Companies spend fortunes building encryption that would take a supercomputer thousands of years to break. They build multi-signature wallets, hardware devices, cold storage systems, biometric locks, layers upon layers of digital protection designed to make a person's cryptocurrency essentially unhackable. And then the joke lands. Why would any criminal bother trying to break through all of that when it is infinitely easier to simply grab a $5 wrench, walk up to the person who holds the password, and beat it out of them until they hand it over willingly? That is the entire concept in one sentence. Digital security is only as strong as the physical safety of the human being who controls it. And once criminals figured that out for real, the joke stopped being funny and became one of the fastest growing categories of violent crime tied to the entire cryptocurrency industry. This is not theoretical. This is happening constantly, in real cases, with real victims, right now. In January of last year, a man named David Ballan, one of the actual co-founders of Ledger, the company that manufactures some of the most widely used hardware wallets in the world, was kidnapped in central France along with his wife. During that attack, according to prosecutors, one of his fingers was severed and sent to his associates as part of the ransom demand. He was eventually rescued, but only after French police mounted a full-scale operation involving organized crime units and elite tactical teams. That is not a rare, isolated horror story either. French authorities have documented well over 100 crypto-linked kidnapping and extortion cases since 2023, with the numbers climbing sharply year after year, so sharply that France's own Interior Ministry has had to convene emergency meetings with cryptocurrency executives just to figure out how to keep their own industry leaders physically safe. Security researchers tracking these crimes globally recorded dozens of verified physical coercion incidents in a single recent year, representing a massive increase over the year before, with tens of millions of dollars in documented losses. And researchers openly admit that number is almost certainly a significant undercount, because plenty of victims never report what happened to them at all. And here is the detail that matters most for our purposes today. These attacks are increasingly not aimed directly at the wealthy crypto holder themselves. Investigators studying this trend in France have identified a disturbing and completely deliberate shift in tactics. Criminal networks have started targeting relatives instead: a father, a daughter, a wife, someone connected to the actual target, but far less protected, far less security conscious, far easier to physically reach. One documented case involved the abduction of a crypto entrepreneur's own father. Another involved the mother of a French magistrate connected to a cryptocurrency investigation. Investigators described this pattern using a specific phrase: calling it proxy target selection, meaning the person who actually gets grabbed off the street or taken from their own home is not necessarily the person the criminals actually want money from. They are simply the most accessible pressure point available. A wealthy or high-profile individual might have security cameras, a gated property, professional protection, or simply enough public awareness of their own risk to be cautious. Their 84-year-old mother, living alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood, almost certainly does not. Now hold that idea in your mind and look directly at the Guthrie case again, because this is exactly where CertiK's classification comes in. According to public reporting, the firm specifically referenced Nancy's disappearance in its own research on this exact criminal trend, describing it as a possible wrench attack by proxy, tied to an early reported ransom demand in the millions of dollars, specifically in Bitcoin. A retired FBI agent who has closely followed this case publicly raised the obvious follow-up question the moment that classification surfaced. Does Savannah Guthrie personally hold a Bitcoin account? That is not an accusation against Savannah. Nobody is suggesting she did anything wrong. It is the exact opposite. It is the theory that Savannah, a nationally recognized, financially successful broadcaster, may have been the actual intended financial target the entire time, while her far more vulnerable, far less protected mother became the proxy, the pressure point, the person criminals believed they could physically reach without ever having to get anywhere near a heavily covered national television host. Think about what that would actually mean if it holds up. It would mean this was never really a story about a random home invasion gone wrong. It would mean somebody sat down, somewhere, and made a calculated decision. They looked at a famous, financially comfortable woman and concluded that going after her directly was too risky, too visible, too likely to fail. And then they looked one level over, at her 84-year-old mother living in a quiet foothills neighborhood outside Tucson, with a normal front door, a normal driveway, and a normal doorbell camera that a person could disable with nothing more than a gloved hand and a nearby tree branch. That is the entire logic of proxy targeting laid out in front of us. Soft target, hard leverage, same result. And the Ledger case is not an isolated horror story sitting alone in the data. Just weeks later, in a separate French operation, 3 masked men attempted a home invasion targeting the head of a major cryptocurrency exchange's French division, forcing their way into an apartment before fleeing empty-handed after apparently hitting the wrong unit. Investigators arrested 3 suspects connected to that attempt on the very same day. Around the same period, French prosecutors charged additional suspects over the abduction of a crypto entrepreneur's own father, a case that reads almost like a blueprint for exactly the kind of proxy targeting we are describing here. A criminal network unable or unwilling to reach the actual wealth holder directly, instead reaching for the person standing one step removed from that wealth, a parent, someone older, someone softer, someone who almost certainly never expected to become a target of anything in his entire life. A separate case near Grenoble involved the mother of a French magistrate, with young suspects allegedly recruited through an encrypted messaging app specifically for a crypto ransom operation. The organizer behind that entire scheme never fully identified. Do you see the pattern forming here? Father, mother, parent, relative. Again and again, the actual crypto holder is not the person who ends up bound, gagged, or threatened at gunpoint. It is almost always somebody standing just outside that wealth, somebody easier to reach, somebody law enforcement in France has started referring to using the exact phrase we already introduced, soft targets carrying hard leverage. This is precisely why French investigators studying their own national surge in these crimes built an entire confidential intelligence report specifically focused on how organizers identify potential victims in the first place. That internal law enforcement analysis found that most kidnappings in this specific category were coordinated by organizers based entirely outside the country, working through local recruiters who then connected with young individuals, often with existing criminal records, willing to carry out the actual violence or intimidation on French soil. The victims themselves, according to that same law enforcement analysis, tended to be relatively young investors, entrepreneurs, or online influencers connected to the crypto world, individuals who had been monitored through their own social media activity long before anyone ever knocked on their door. Read that last detail again slowly, because it matters enormously for everything we are about to discuss. Monitored through their own social media activity, before anyone ever showed up in person. That is not hacking. That is not a data breach. That is simply watching what somebody posts, what somebody says in interviews, what somebody's public life reveals about their private wealth, and building an entire criminal operation on top of nothing more sophisticated than patient, careful observation. Let's talk about why the physical evidence in this case actually supports that reading, because this is where things get genuinely uncomfortable. From the very beginning, investigators and commentators alike have struggled to explain a strange contradiction sitting right at the center of this crime. The man seen on the doorbell camera appeared to understand certain things at an almost professional level. He wore gloves. He wore a mask. He arrived deep in the overnight hours when the neighborhood would be quiet. He moved directly toward the security camera and tried to disable it. And yet, in that same sequence of actions, he also did something almost amateurish, attempting to physically block the lens using nothing but a nearby branch. In the dark, clearly improvising in the moment rather than executing some flawless professional plan. That contradiction, sophistication mixed with clumsiness, planning mixed with improvisation, has bothered nearly everyone who has studied this case closely. But it stops being confusing the moment you apply the proxy targeting model to it. In documented wrench attack cases overseas, investigators have repeatedly found the exact same split. The organizer, the person who actually identifies the target, understands the financial landscape, and decides who to go after, is very often not the same person who physically shows up to commit the abduction. French investigators studying their own surge in these crimes have specifically described a pattern in which organizers based outside the country recruit local individuals, often young men with existing criminal records, to carry out the physical intrusion itself. The organizer brings financial sophistication. The recruit brings physical risk. Neither one necessarily has the other's skill set. That split explains, almost perfectly, why a criminal operation could simultaneously demonstrate real planning around cryptocurrency, real understanding of anonymized communication, real patience in choosing the exact overnight hour to strike, while also producing a masked figure fumbling with tree branches in someone's front yard at nearly 2 in the morning. One part of this operation may have been run by someone financially literate and digitally careful. The physical part on the ground may have been carried out by someone considerably less experienced, someone hired specifically because they were willing to do the dangerous, visible part of the job. This also reframes the ransom demand itself in a completely different light. A random opportunist targeting an elderly woman with no connection to significant wealth typically demands a number that reflects wishful thinking rather than actual knowledge, an arbitrary, hopeful figure with no real basis. But the reported early demand in this case was specific, substantial, and denominated entirely in cryptocurrency, complete with detailed payment instructions. That is not the language of someone guessing. That is the language of someone who believed, rightly or wrongly, that there was real digital wealth somewhere connected to this family, wealth large enough to justify the enormous risk of an armed nighttime home invasion. Whether that belief was accurate is a separate question entirely. Plenty of wrench attacks documented overseas have targeted people whom criminals merely believed held significant crypto assets, based on nothing more than public visibility, social media activity, or secondhand rumor, only to discover afterward that the actual holdings were smaller, non-existent, or controlled by someone else entirely. Belief is often enough to trigger violence. Accuracy is not required. And this brings us to one of the most overlooked details in the entire case. The fact that the Bitcoin wallet named in that early communication reportedly never moved. Investigators sent a small test payment into it specifically to see whether the person controlling that address would touch the money, and according to what has been reported, it simply sat there, untouched, silent. If you assume this was a simple, unsophisticated criminal acting alone, that silence is genuinely strange. Why would someone demanding a life-changing amount of money simply ignore even a small test transaction landing in their own wallet? To understand why that silence might actually be the smartest move a criminal in this position could make, you have to understand a little bit about how blockchain investigations actually work, because most people assume cryptocurrency is completely anonymous, and that assumption is simply wrong. Every single Bitcoin transaction ever made is permanently recorded on a public ledger that anyone in the world can view forever. What cryptocurrency actually offers is pseudonymity, not anonymity, meaning a wallet address itself does not automatically reveal a real name. But the moment that wallet interacts with anything connected to a real identity, a cryptocurrency exchange that requires identification to sign up, a purchase made using that wallet, a transfer to another wallet that has already been linked to a known individual, investigators and the private companies that specialize in blockchain analysis can begin building a chain connecting an anonymous address directly to a real, named human being. Major blockchain intelligence firms have built entire businesses around exactly this kind of tracing work, and law enforcement agencies routinely use these same tools to follow ransomware payments, extortion demands, and stolen funds across the blockchain until they eventually surface at an exchange willing to hand over account information tied to a real identity. That is precisely why a financially literate criminal organizer would understand, immediately and instinctively, that touching a monitored wallet is one of the single most dangerous mistakes available to them. The moment funds move, even a small amount, even what looks like a test transaction, that movement becomes a permanent, traceable event. It can be followed forward, transaction by transaction, hop by hop, sometimes across dozens of intermediate wallets, until it lands somewhere identifiable. Professional criminal networks running these extortion operations overseas have been documented specifically coaching intermediaries and victims on exactly how to avoid this kind of traceable movement, instructing them to use techniques designed to break the chain of custody on the blockchain, or simply refusing to touch funds at all until they are completely certain the transaction cannot be traced back to them. Silence, in that specific context, stops looking like confusion or abandonment of the plan. It starts looking like discipline, like someone who understands the technology well enough to know that patience is safer than greed. A 5-year-old with a phone can generate a Bitcoin wallet address in under a minute. Understanding why you should never let money actually move through it takes real, specific knowledge of how these investigations unfold. That distinction alone tells you something meaningful about who might be sitting behind this entire operation. Now let's sit with the darkest implication of this entire theory, because it deserves to be said plainly rather than danced around. If Nancy was targeted specifically as a proxy meant to pressure access to someone else's digital wealth, then her actual value to whoever took her was never really about her personally. It was about what leverage she represented. And leverage, once it stops working, once a plan collapses, once the intended target refuses or is simply unable to provide what was demanded, tends to become a liability rather than an asset. That single, brutal logic may explain something that has haunted this case from the moment it became public, the reported shift between an early communication describing Nancy as frightened but alive, and a later one describing something having gone catastrophically wrong. A pressure campaign built entirely around forcing access to money does not need its hostage to survive once the plan behind it has already failed. It only needed her to be useful as leverage while the plan was still in motion. That is precisely why the specific demand for cryptocurrency in this case matters so much more than it might first appear. Cash ransom demands are ancient. They are simple, universally understood, and require no special knowledge whatsoever. A demand denominated specifically in Bitcoin, accompanied by detailed technical instructions for completing that kind of transfer, signals something different. It signals a criminal operation already oriented around the digital financial world, already thinking in terms of wallets and blockchain rather than duffel bags of cash left under a bridge. That orientation does not appear randomly. It appears when the person or people planning a crime already believe the target, or someone connected to the target, exists inside that same digital financial world. In other words, the method of the ransom demand itself is a clue about who the planners believe they were actually dealing with. Let's also talk honestly about what this theory does not do, because responsible reporting on this case has to hold both things at once. Neither the FBI nor the Pima County Sheriff's Department has publicly confirmed CertiK's classification. Sheriff Chris Nanos has stated publicly that investigators believe they already know the motive behind Nancy's abduction, but he has deliberately declined to reveal what that motive actually is. That silence could mean law enforcement is quietly working from exactly this crypto-based theory and simply protecting an active investigation from public interference. It could also mean the actual motive is something else entirely, something that has nothing to do with cryptocurrency at all, and the wrench attack classification is simply an outside company pattern matching a case from open-source information without any direct knowledge of what investigators actually possess. CertiK is a highly respected firm within the blockchain security world, but respected firms still operate from limited information when they are analyzing a case from the outside rather than working directly inside the investigation itself. A classification made from public reporting, however well-informed, is still fundamentally different from a conclusion reached by federal agents who have actually seen the physical evidence, reviewed the actual financial records, and interviewed the actual family members involved. There is also a version of skepticism worth taking seriously here, one that good crime researchers raise about almost every high-profile theory that gains traction online. It is entirely possible that this classification exists simply because CertiK and the broader cryptocurrency security industry generally has a strong incentive to draw attention to the growing danger of wrench attacks as a category of crime. A famous, heavily covered case like this one provides an enormously effective, attention-grabbing example to attach to a report the firm was already planning to publish about a documented, genuinely rising trend. That does not necessarily mean the classification is wrong. It simply means the motivation behind highlighting this particular case deserves the same scrutiny as the theory itself. Good true crime analysis holds multiple possibilities at once rather than collapsing immediately into the most dramatic available explanation. But even accounting for that healthy skepticism, the broader trend this theory sits inside is undeniably real, and it is worth understanding on its own terms, separate from whether it turns out to explain the Guthrie case specifically. Wrench attacks as a documented global phenomenon have exploded over a remarkably short period of time. Security researchers tracking these incidents recorded dramatically more verified physical coercion cases in the most recent full year studied compared to the year before it, representing one of the sharpest single-year increases ever recorded in this specific category of crime. Kidnapping has become the single dominant method within that broader category, overtaking simple threats and home invasions that do not involve an actual abduction. Physical assaults connected to these cases have also risen sharply. Losses tied to confirmed incidents already run into the tens of millions of dollars annually, and researchers studying the phenomenon are explicit that this figure represents only the cases that actually get reported, meaning the true global scale is almost certainly much larger than what shows up in any official count. Europe has become the epicenter of this specific criminal trend, with France alone accounting for a disproportionate share of all documented cases worldwide. French law enforcement has responded by charging dozens of suspects, including individuals barely out of their teenage years, across more than a dozen active judicial investigations into these crimes. Investigators there have identified a specific operational structure behind many of these attacks, organizers based outside the country coordinating with local recruiters, who in turn connect with young individuals willing to carry out the actual physical intimidation or violence on the ground. That structure, layered, transnational, deliberately separating the financial planning from the physical risk, is precisely the kind of organized criminal architecture that would explain a case exhibiting exactly the contradictions we see in the Guthrie investigation: real planning around anonymized digital payment, alongside a physically clumsy, seemingly improvised intrusion carried out by someone who may have had very little personal stake in the financial outcome at all. Investigators studying this trend overseas have also identified something else worth applying directly to this case: the increasing use of open-source intelligence to identify potential targets in the first place. Criminal networks running these operations do not necessarily need insider access to someone's private bank records. They can build a surprisingly accurate picture of a target's financial world using nothing more than publicly available information: social media activity, professional profiles, news coverage, even casual mentions in interviews or public appearances. This is worth slowing down on, because it is genuinely one of the most important shifts in how modern crime actually gets planned. A generation ago, identifying a wealthy target required either personal connection or old-fashioned surveillance: someone physically watching a house, following a car, asking around a neighborhood. Today, a person sitting anywhere in the world with an internet connection can assemble an enormous amount of accurate, actionable information about almost anyone with any degree of public visibility, entirely for free, entirely legally, without ever leaving their chair. A public figure's career trajectory, their approximate income bracket based on publicly reported salary information, their family structure, the names of their parents, the general area where those parents live, All of that is often sitting in plain view across news archives, social media posts, and public records, waiting for anyone patient enough to piece it together. Security researchers who study this exact category of crime describe the process almost like assembling a puzzle from pieces nobody realizes they are handing out. A single interview where a public figure mentions visiting their mother. A local news story from years earlier that happens to mention a parent's neighborhood. A social media post geotagged near a family home. None of these pieces are dangerous in isolation. Almost nobody would think twice about any single one of them. But assembled together by someone with the patience and motivation to do it, they can produce a remarkably precise picture of exactly where a vulnerable relative lives, what their daily routine looks like, and how exposed their home security actually is. A well-known television personality, someone whose career, public statements, and general lifestyle receive constant national media coverage, would represent an unusually information-rich target for exactly this kind of open-source research. Criminals do not need Savannah Guthrie's actual account balances to form a belief about her financial world. They only need enough publicly available signal to convince themselves that belief is worth acting on, and a public figure with a decades-long broadcasting career generates an enormous volume of exactly that kind of signal without ever intending to. It is also worth noting that this kind of research does not require any special technical skill at all. It does not require hacking. It does not require breaking any law until the moment someone actually decides to act on what they have learned. That is part of what makes this category of crime so difficult to prevent proactively. There is no single intrusion, no single breach, no single moment where a security system could have flagged something wrong, because nothing about the research phase itself is illegal or even unusual. The danger only becomes visible the moment someone decides to convert that research into an actual physical plan, and by then, the target has often already been identified, studied, and scheduled long before the first masked figure ever approaches an actual front door. If you accept even the possibility that this theory holds real weight, it forces you to look at almost every previously discussed piece of evidence in this case through an entirely new lens. The masked man's decision to strike in the deep overnight hours stops looking like simple caution and starts looking like a deliberate attempt to avoid any witness who might later provide a description connecting the crime to a specific, targeted plan rather than a random burglary. The reported earlier sighting of a similar figure near the property, seemingly scouting the location before the actual abduction, stops looking like a strange coincidence and starts looking exactly like the kind of pre-attack surveillance documented in multiple overseas wrench attack cases, where targets are studied, camera locations are mapped, and entry points are identified well before the actual attack takes place. Even the specific choice to demand payment in Bitcoin rather than cash stops looking like an arbitrary decision and starts looking like direct evidence of what kind of wealth the planners genuinely believed they were pursuing. It also reframes the profile of who might actually be responsible for this crime. A theory built entirely around a random, opportunistic home invasion points toward a suspect pool built from proximity alone. Someone who happened to live nearby, someone with a history of property crime, someone who simply saw an isolated elderly woman as an easy target. A theory built around deliberate proxy targeting for cryptocurrency access points toward an entirely different kind of suspect profile. Someone who had specific reason to believe Nancy's family held meaningful digital wealth. Someone financially literate enough to understand how cryptocurrency ransom demands actually function. Someone potentially organized enough to separate the planning of a crime from its physical execution. Exactly the structure documented again and again in cases overseas. That is not necessarily a stranger who happened to notice a famous name attached to a quiet Arizona address. That could just as easily be someone operating with actual knowledge of this family's world, someone who understood enough about their public profile and private circumstances to identify Nancy specifically as the softest possible point of entry into that world. None of this changes the fundamental, unbearable reality sitting underneath every single theory anyone has offered about this case. Nancy Guthrie remains missing. No suspect has been publicly named. No arrest has been made. Whether this crime began as a wrench attack aimed at digital wealth connected to her daughter, or whether it began as something else entirely that simply happened to demand payment in cryptocurrency, because that is increasingly how ransom demands are made in this era, the physical reality remains exactly the same. An 84-year-old woman was taken from her own home in the middle of the night, and months later, Her family is still waiting for an answer that would allow them to either bring her home or finally know the truth about what happened to her. What the wrench attack theory does offer, regardless of whether it turns out to be fully accurate, is a genuinely useful framework for understanding a case that has otherwise felt scattered, contradictory, and difficult to make sense of. It explains why a crime scene could show both careful planning and obvious amateur mistakes at the same time. It explains why a ransom demand specifically requested cryptocurrency rather than cash. It explains why a monitored wallet might sit completely untouched for months on end. It explains why investigators might genuinely believe they already understand the motive behind this crime while still being unable, for entirely legitimate investigative reasons, to publicly name a single suspect. And it forces an uncomfortable but increasingly unavoidable question out into the open, one that applies to a growing number of families connected to visible wealth in this new financial era. If criminals are increasingly deciding that the fastest path past encryption, past multi-signature wallets, past every digital safeguard modern technology can offer, runs directly through the people closest to a wealthy or high-profile individual rather than through that individual themselves, then anyone connected to significant digital wealth, a spouse, a child, a parent, even a mother living quietly in a peaceful Arizona suburb who has spent her entire life completely outside the world of finance, may be far closer to real physical danger than anyone in that family ever imagined possible. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of the wrench attack theory, whether or not it ultimately proves to be the answer in Nancy Guthrie's specific case. Digital wealth was supposed to make people safer, harder to rob, harder to reach, protected behind layers of mathematics that no ordinary criminal could ever hope to break. What this growing pattern of violence reveals instead is something far more unsettling. The safest vault in the world does nothing to protect the people standing outside it. And as long as that remains true, the question this entire theory raises is not really about Bitcoin or wallets or blockchain analysis at all. It is about who, in any family connected to real wealth, has quietly become the softest, most reachable target simply by being the one standing closest to someone else's fortune. Think about how quietly this danger has grown compared to almost every other category of financial crime society has learned to guard against. Banks spend billions of dollars every year on fraud prevention, on encrypted transactions, on identity verification, on insurance funds designed to make customers whole the moment something goes wrong. Cryptocurrency exchanges have raced to build similarly impressive digital fortresses, cold storage systems kept completely offline, multi-signature approval processes requiring several separate people to authorize any major transfer, hardware wallets that physically cannot be accessed without a device sitting in someone's actual hand. All of that engineering, all of that investment, all of that genuine technical brilliance. And it turns out the actual weak point was never the mathematics at all. It was a mother, standing in her own kitchen, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, who had never once considered herself part of anyone's financial world. That is what makes this specific theory so difficult to simply dismiss as internet speculation, even while holding onto every legitimate caveat we have already discussed. It fits a documented, verified, rapidly growing pattern of real crimes happening to real families in multiple countries right now. It explains contradictions in the physical evidence that other, simpler theories have consistently struggled to account for. And it forces open a conversation that extends far beyond this one investigation. A conversation about what it actually means to be connected to visible wealth in an era where a criminal no longer needs to break into your accounts, when they can simply walk through the life of someone you love instead. We still do not have a confirmed answer in this case. We may not have one for a long time. But if this theory holds even a fraction of the weight the researchers behind it believe it does, then somewhere behind every single piece of evidence we have already discussed in this case sits one specific, deliberate decision made by someone who is still, as of this moment, walking free. Not a decision to hurt a stranger at random. A decision to look at an entire family's world, identify its softest possible point of entry, and walk straight through the front door that a truly wealthy target would never have left unguarded. That is the theory. That is what it would mean if it is true. And until investigators either confirm or dismantle it publicly, it remains one of the single most important open threads in the entire Nancy Guthrie case. If this changed the way you understand this story even slightly, that is exactly why we made this video. And it is exactly the kind of angle we will keep chasing on this channel until real answers finally arrive. Thank you for watching Criminal Static, and we will see you in the next one.